Right, let's make a start. Um, so last week we covered quite a lot. So this is for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We're going through the Sira of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I did say it's not going to be a necessarily your typical Sira that begins from the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and works through the key events. What I want to do is try and do as much justice to it as possible. It's also a bit of a passion of mine, and it's been something that I've wanted to do for a long time. So it's all built up. Um, so I want to make sure I try and get through as much of the content, which I think is really interesting and actually really important for the Sira, which is a lot of the foundational stuff. I want to cover as much of that as possible, and hopefully, when we get into the kind of the more familiar Sira, you'll be more comfortable with it, and hopefully, from a retention point of view, it'll be a lot easier to retain. It's really easy to remember the stories that are repeated often in gatherings like like the story of the Mi'raj, um, and maybe some particulars about the Battle of Badr. But actually, this is about having a connection to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the Sirah means going on a journey with somebody, which means we should be aspiring to just be able to close our eyes and picture ourselves in that life. And when somebody mentions a surah, or if you hear about an event, you cannot it's not like an intellectual sort of exercise of you try it's not a retention kind of game that you're playing. It's more about just trying to put yourself in that scenario because you're familiar with the context, not just the specific event. So that's what we'd at least attempt to try and do, inshallah, which means we have to put a lot of groundwork in, and that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is because many of us don't get a chance to sit and learn about the lives of other prophets. There are lots of good books out there, and some of us probably have gone through the stories of the prophets and the stories of the Sahaba in madrasa. um, but again, they're at an age when we're quite young and we probably don't pick up a lot of the details, and we're not necessarily fascinated, enthralled by those stories because it's almost like a something you have to just get through. So this is a chance to do that, but I also want to make sure I anchor as much of this in the Quran, because I think that's my second kind of point, which is to familiarize ourselves with some of the stories, the interconnecting stories between the various prophets, and to try and revive our connection to the Quran through those stories. There are many of these qisas, stories in the Quran, and we read them in a very we can read them in a very haphazard way, and that's through no fault of you know of it's not our fault necessarily, because we're not really taught to read them as stories. What we do is we just read kind of in a linear fashion the Quran from the beginning to the end, where actually the Quran is a lot more cyclic than that. So we often find that stories are told in one part of the Quran and later picked up somewhere else. And you wouldn't think to during whilst reading a story to stop and actually go and read the rest of the story in another surah. It's not something you kind of intuitively do. So that's one of the things that I'd like to do. And I'm also on a bit of a quest, and yesterday we picked this up in our podcast, um, a quest to start reflecting more on the Quran, because I've come to learn that that is a skill. And I have a class that I do every week, and some of my students are on here, where I do a lot of that reflecting on. We're going through Juz Amma, um, and I hope the students are seeing actually, and I'm noticing it by the questions they ask or the way they, I suppose, make suggestions, that they are starting to learn how to, they're starting to learn how to reflect on the Quran, which is such an important skill that we all have the tools to be able to do. It just sometimes needs a bit of a nudge or a bit of guidance to be able to make that happen. So this is another chance, hopefully, as we go through the Sirah, to every now and again take that chance to do tadabbur al-Quran, or to reflect on the Quran, which is something that the Quran itself calls us to do. But unfortunately, I think that's been hijacked, because we're often led to believe that the tafsir is the domain of the scholars. And that's true. Tafsir is the domain of the scholars, but tafsir doesn't mean, is not the same as reflection. Tafsir is to claim that when God revealed a certain verse, it definitely means X, Y, and Z. It's to say that by either attributing it to the Prophet ﷺ, or passing off your own interpretation of that verse as the kind of reason why God revealed that verse. We don't have authority to do that, because we just don't have the evidence to back that up. But to say the verse could mean this, or to say a particular verse means X, Y, and Z to me, is perfectly acceptable. Every one of us are allowed to do that. So don't ever think, if someone tells you that's not permissible, it's just simply not true. They're just hijacking. They're doing, they're taking ownership of the Quran. The Quran belongs to every single one of us. It's not, some of the commentators would say that, when you read the Quran, it's as though that verse is revealed for you. Yeah, which means we can all look at the same verse of Quran and take a completely different message from it. And that's perfectly possible. Equally, you can open up a verse of Quran and then read that same verse again 6 months, a year, 5 years down the line, and take something completely different from it. And the reason for that is you're a completely different frame of mind. You've got a completely different experience, a different perspective. And when you approach the Quran with that, you take a completely new value and meaning from it. And that's the beauty of the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us. That you can't exhaust the meanings of the Quran. If you were to fill an entire ocean with ink, you still could not exhaust the meanings that are found in the Quran. What does that mean? Does that mean that it's all tafsir? Absolutely not. It means we all have the tools to reflect, but sometimes what we need to do is we need a bit of a helping hand, so we can apply those tools or skills, and that's where teachers come in. What are some of the books you would recommend to learn from the lives of other prophets? I don't know of any in English. I'm not aware of many, to be honest. And that's not to say they don't exist. It's just I'm a bit out of touch, for being completely honest. So if somebody else can suggest anything they've come across in English that they've found helpful about the lives of the other prophets, then by all means put them up. I'm sure there's going to be lots. Go into a local bookstore and you'll find. I'm certain you'll find probably an entire bookshelf dedicated to either stories of different prophets or a book dedicated to a prophet. Yeah, I'm confident of that. You're not going to you'll get books like that. The only thing that I would probably be cautious about, and we learn that as we go through it today, actually, is a lot of what we know about the prophets comes from I suppose this is a good place to start, actually. When I talk about the lives of the prophets, the lives of Sayyidina Nuh, Sayyidina Ibrahim, Sayyidina Ismail, Sayyidina Adam, if any of those prophets, Sayyidina Hud, Sayyidina Salih, and so on, Ibn Khaldun says, who's a great anthropologist, sociologist, historian in the Muslim tradition. He says, whenever we talk about prophets of the past, they come from either what we know with certainty, and that's from the Quran. Yeah. And although there's some of the key events are fleshed out quite a bit, there's lots of things that are omitted. So either it comes from the Quran, or it comes from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he explicitly describes something about a prophet. That's number two. Again, that's few and far between. Number three, it comes from other traditions like the Bible, or it comes from the Torah, or from other books of other revealed religions. And that can be because of the Muslim historians that studied those books. So that's very possible, like Imam Tabari, for instance, a very early historian, but also is very well versed in other traditions. It can come from people that converted to Islam, and this includes the Sahaba who themselves had lived probably 50 or so years as scholars within the Jewish tradition or as scholars within another community. And when they became Muslims, they brought that with them and they shared it. So that's another kind of a reference point. And sometimes it comes from just opinions of commentators, but we don't really have any evidence other than that they said it. And there's quite a lot of that out there. And the thing is, many people, when they narrate stories, they often don't really distinguish between which story comes in the Quran and which one doesn't, which one is from a biblical narration and which comes from a historian's just personal opinion. And that's usually okay. I mean, it's not a big deal, except where it contradicts the Quran. And there are plenty of examples of where the biblical tradition it contradicts the Quran. Simple things like if you look at the biblical account of Sayyidina Nuh, very different to what the Muslims say about it. You know, Sayyidina Nuh is described as a drunkard after the flood, you know, and all sorts of things about the way he behaved and the curse that he put on his child and so on and so forth. That's not going to be found in the Quran. Yeah, in the Quran we describe him as a prophet, as a saintly person, you know, somebody who worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and submitted to his will completely, which meant, you know, watching his son perish. So we describe in two very different ways. Similarly, ages of prophets, you know, in the Bible, you might have someone described as being 50 years old. In the Quran, it might be described as he was, you know, 300 years old and so on. So there can be differences, which means overlaps between prophets and things like that, where it can get confusing. So if you rely on somebody who does know, who does understand these things and has kind of been at least delineated between where there are overlaps that are okay, acceptable, that don't necessarily contradict, and overlaps where they do contradict, then it's not too much of a big deal, because it is a historical account. It's not, these are not points of iman or belief. But where somebody hasn't, they've just literally cut and paste, and you do get plenty of people out there that do this. A lot of the books that are written today, unfortunately, especially the ones that come in like, you know, 40, 50 pages that you can find in a local Islamic bookshop, written by, I don't know, I'm not even going to throw out a name or two, but it's probably not fair on them. These are cut and paste jobs, and they're not really very academic, which means you're at the mercy of that person's research. It probably won't be that thorough. Will it be massively detrimental for you? Not really, but it's always good to try and find something a bit more authoritative if possible. So just be careful. I would much rather say, if you want to find stories of the prophets, it's a good chance to start with the Quran. Like, go to the Quran. And I don't mean open up the Quran and start reading it. I mean, if you feel more comfortable, go onto Google and type in the name of a prophet, or type into Google, and I don't know, I've not tried this yet, but say just list of prophets in Islam. Start from the top. What does the Quran say about them? And learn about them through the Quran. And then you can start Googling what are the various hadith on it, and see if anything's sound or not sound. Again, and this might be a bit controversial, but you know, when scholars say things like, oh, don't Google, don't take it, it's all, in my personal view, it's all nonsense. There's a lot out there. There are reliable scholars out there that have said something's authentic. And if you know of that scholar, or if you can go get that scholar verified by somebody, if they say it's sound, you can generally rely on it. Yeah, it's not like it's going to be massively out. So as long as you're not taking, as I said, strange stuff that doesn't seem to be orthodox, then you know, I think if you want to start at that point, that's better, I would say, than finding like a 400-page book on the life of, you know, Sayyidina Idris, when we know barely a word about him in reality, but yet somebody's managed to write a 350-page book on it. Then I would probably be more cautious about that. How can you better a relationship with the Quran and not have such a perfectionist standard? And by relationship, I mean a true connection, not just a perfunctory reading. It's a the answer to that, to be honest, is you've got to start with the perfunctory reading. You've got to start somewhere. You know, read the Quran. In fact, no, let me rewind that. It's not an either or. We should be reading the Quran regularly. This is something that should just be in our daily wird, to read the Quran regularly. And in doing so, we should also, alongside that, every time we come across them, try and read English translation. So if you read 2 pages a day, why not read one page and read one page of translation? Yeah, you will be, I promise you, you'll be surprised. In just give yourself 1 month of doing that. Do it for 1 month. Read one page. Even when you want to read more than one page, just stop at one page. In fact, the adab of reading the Quran, as Imam Nawawi and others have said, is you should stop reading when you desire to read more, and you should continue reading when you desire to stop. So actually, by creating this desire to want to read more Quran, but stopping and then reading a translation, and you have this constant, this passion to read more, is itself from the adab of the Quran, because it really gives you motivation to pick it up again the following day. So as I said, our knowledge of this history of the previous prophets comes primarily from the Quran, and then various opinions of different commentators, Muslims that entered Islam, and brought their kind of knowledge of their traditions to us, and so on. The oldest kind of communities that we know of actually go back to the time of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam. They go back to Sayyidina Nuh. And the reason for that is because when the great flood of the Prophet Nuh came, it wiped out everyone in there's a few opinions. One is everywhere in the world. Another one is restricted just to that location, yeah, which was Mesopotamia. Another said it was restricted just to the area of Babylon. So there's difference of opinion as to where this flood covered. But either way, the oldest kind of genuine accounts that we have go to the time of Sayyidina Nuh, but even that is quite speculative. Yeah, it's quite speculative. When we have narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, and likewise Sayyidina Ibn Abbas and Ibn Mas'ud, where they did not take their lineage back beyond the grandchildren of Sayyidina Ismail. They didn't go beyond the grandchildren of Sayyidina Ismail because it became quite speculative. So I want to start today's lesson. So last week we finished talking about the life of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, but I deliberately missed a lot of the detail of his early life. So we went straight into the center of his life, and I missed out the bit where he goes to Mecca, and I missed out everything from the beginning in terms of him as a baby. I did that deliberately because last week I wanted to focus just on the Quranic narrative of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we don't really have anything about him as a baby other than the narration of him, which some scholars say was while he was in the cradle, of when and I covered this last week, of when he started asking about the stars and the moon and the sun, and each of them, when they waned, he said, "This is not my Lord." Yeah. So many of the scholars say this was when revelation came to him, i.e., that he now was he was anointed as a prophet, or he announced his prophethood, and then he was commanded to go and call to his to the religion of the Hanif religion, the religion of the one true God. So what I want to do today is, before we start going forward in time to Sayyidina Ismail, I think it's also important to actually go further back now, because the reason is because as we go forward, Sayyidina Ismail, when we get to the life time of Sayyidina Ismail, there's a connection between Sayyidina Ismail and the Arabs, and it's through that connection do we have the bloodline of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They're called the Adnani Arabs. Yeah, and the Adnani Arabs were a product of Sayyidina Ismail marrying into the tribes of the Jurhum. And the Jurhum were the pure Arabs of the time. So they became known as the Adnani Arabs. The Arabs were of three types. So historically, there are three types of Arabs. And they trace their lineage, the Arabs, so all Arabs trace their lineage back to Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam. Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, what do we know about him? We know that he lived at least, the gap between Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sayyidina Nuh was probably around anywhere between 300 years to something less than 300 years. We have nothing explicit in the Quran that tells us, nor do we have anything explicit in the Hadith that tells us what that difference was. The only other detail that we have in the Hadith is when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us in Sahih Bukhari that the time somebody asked him how long after Sayyidina Adam was Sayyidina Nuh sent, and the Prophet ﷺ said the equivalent of 1,000 years. So from the time of the first of creation, Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, to Sayyidina Nuh was about 1,000 years. And we also know, and this again is not, we don't know this categorically, but it seems that there were about 8 generations. In other words, 8 sons between Sayyidina Adam and Sayyidina Nuh. And from Sayyidina Nuh, we have a few generations and we go to, so probably 2, maybe 3 generations, and we go to Sayyidina, maybe 3, maybe 4 generations before we get to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. In the biblical tradition, they say that Sayyidina Nuh and Sayyidina Ibrahim crossed over. So there was about 53 years where Sayyidina Nuh was still alive and Sayyidina Ibrahim was alive. Yeah, so they say. And the reason for that is that, and the other thing that we know is the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Ankabut, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا نُوحًا إِلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ فَلَبِثَ فِيهِمْ أَلْفَ سَنَةٍ إِلَّا خَمْسِينَ. Allah says that, and we sent Sayyidina Nuh, we sent Nuh to his people, فَلَبِثَ فِيهِمْ, and he resided, he lived amongst them. For how long? For أَلْفَ سَنَةٍ, 1,000 years, إِلَّا خَمْسِينَ, except for 50. In other words, he lived for 950 years. فَأَخَذَهُمُ الطُّوفَانُ وَهُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. And the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Ankabut, and then the flood took them, and they were all the unjust. So from that, we know Sayyidina Nuh lived for 950 years. We know speculatively that he was about 600 years old when the floods came. Sayyidina Nuh was about 600 years when the floods came. And therefore, that means after the floods, he would have lived for about 350 years. So the biblical account of Sayyidina Ibrahim is that Sayyidina Ibrahim was born when Sayyidina Nuh would have been in the 290 something after the flood. So that's about 52 odd years, or 53 years. That's a bit more explicit. We don't really know, or at least according to my relatively small amount of research, I don't know. There's a question which is fairly relevant. In Islam, do we take these as literal years? We don't know. The one thing we do know is that the Arabs, and this is the Arabs, I mean, when I say Arabs here, I mean the kind of the Muslim historians post, during the Islamic era, they were quite relaxed in how they used years. So when they said, 100 years, it probably didn't mean 100 years. And if they said 1,000 years, it probably didn't mean 1,000 years. So no, we have nothing explicit about whether these years are literal or not. But when the Quran says something like 950 years, the general rule is that we assume it to be literal unless there's evidence to the contrary. Okay? So no, we don't automatically assume something is literal for any of this, in any other situation, especially when historians mention numbers. Because the Arabs, it just wasn't their custom. In their custom, they weren't that specific. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ says, "Nahnu qawmun ummiyun la nahsib, la naktubu la nahsib." So we neither write nor do we do numbers, because it wasn't something. They kind of gave ballpark numbers. But the rule in Quran is that when God says 950, we assume 950 unless there's reason to believe otherwise. So what we have then is Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam at the age of 600 odd, these floods come. We know that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam had 5 sons. Again, we don't know this through the Quran. So this is, again, historians and asanid, but many of them are munqati. Munqati means some of them are broken chains, some of them are kind of pieced together from different chains. So Allahu Alam. But we believe he had five sons. And we believe this Arabs came from his son Sam. So he had 5 sons. One of his sons was called Sam. Now, what's interesting is in the Quran, we have the story of Sayyidina Nuh. Yeah, we have the story of Sayyidina Nuh, which is, and it's called Surah Nuh. And in it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, and I will go through this inshallah, just so that you see, kind of wherever we get the chance, let's go into these stories inshallah. The Quran says, "Inna arsalna Nuhan ila qawmihi an anzir qawmaka min qabli an ya'tiyahum azabun alim." Allah begins with, and we sent Sayyidina Nuh to his people, warn your people before there comes to them a painful torment, a punishment. قال يا قوم إني لكم نذير مبين. And then Sayyidina Nuh goes to his people and he says, I've come to you as this, as a clear warner from God. أن اعبدوا الله, worship God. واتقوه وأطيعون, and be give him his due. واتقوه means you must be aware that he exists. وأطيعون, and worship him. What happened was, in the time of Nuh, so by the time that Sayyidina Nuh had come, people had lost their way. Yes, from the time of Sayyidina Adam, people had begun to lose their way. And his people began to worship idols. They began to worship idols like Wad, Suwa', Yaghuth, Ya'uq, and Nasr. These are the idols that they worshipped. And we know the names of those idols because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَقَالُوا لَا تَذَرُنَّ آلِهَتَكُمْ وَلَا تَذَرُنَّ وَدًّا وَلَا سُوَاعًا وَلَا يَغُوثَ وَيَعُوقَ وَنَسْرًا. The Quran tells us in Surah Nuh what the names of those idols were. The commentators say that actually these idols were once upon a time pious people. And actually this is quite a common theme you find of idolatry. Starts from something quite sincere, where you have some people that are religious, respected folk, and people, as a symbol of them, take something away. So it may be a rock, it may be something symbolic, and then as the centuries turn, those idols, those kind of relics, become themselves objects of worship. And just hold on to that, because in the future, inshallah, as we get to the lifetime of the Prophet, you'll see that the same thing happens again. In the time of Thamud, the same thing happened. People who started worshipping idols that once stemmed from their love of pious. So sometimes you can have something that actually may have started with a very good intention, but over time, it loses its way. And I think there's a lesson in there for us, in that just putting the shirk bit to one side for a second, the importance of constantly rectifying our intention and checking ourselves, and really sanity checking even our allegiances, because it's so easy to get sucked into a mindset without really being reflective, but also being your own critical friend. Yeah, it's extremely important that we do that, and we shouldn't stop doing that just because we're studying religious texts. So really keep that in mind, inshallah. So these, some of the lessons that we can take from these sorts of stories are that people can go to extremes. You can have extremely pious people that just as the centuries unfold, what started off as a good deed becomes a something else for other people. So in Surah Nuh, this is God tells us, continues to tell us the story. يغفر لكم من ذنوبكم ويؤخركم إلى أجل مسمى إن أجر الله إذا جاء لا يؤخر. And Sayyidina Nuh now is calling his people and telling them, look, when turn to God and ask forgiveness, the doors of forgiveness have not closed. If you ask, God will forgive, and he will, but once your appointed time comes, there's no delaying to it. لا يؤخر, it will never be delayed. لو كنتم تعلمون, if only you would heed and understand. قال رب إني دعوت قومي ليلا ونهارا. And then Sayyidina Nuh says, he turns to God and says, oh Allah, I have been calling my people day and night. قال إني دعوت قومي ليلا ونهارا. Oh Allah, I have been calling my people day and night. فلم يزدهم دعائي إلا فرارا. And my calling them doesn't increase them but in distance. In what he's saying is that every time he calls them, he's become so, to them they've just stopped listening. And he said, the more I call them, the more they run away from me. وإني كلما دعوتهم لتغفر لهم جعلوا أصابعهم في آذانهم. And he says, every time I call them to God, he call them to you, they literally put their fingers in their ears. and they say وَاسْتَغْشَوْا ثِيَابَهُمْ, and they cover themselves with their thobes. وَأَصَرُّوا وَاسْتَكْبَرُوا اسْتِكْبَارًا, and he says, and they just continue, persist in their way, and they're becoming more and more arrogant in that, and meaning they are, because what he means by that is the more I call them, the more stubborn they become. Yeah. ثُمَّ إِنِّي دَعُوتُهُمْ جِهَارًا, and then he says, oh Allah, I then call them, I try different ways of calling them. Just make sure if everyone can just have their mics switched off, inshallah. I tried different ways of calling them. ثُمَّ إِنِّي أَعْلَنْتُ لَهُمْ وَأَسْرَرْتُ لَهُمْ إِسْرَارًا. He said, I called them, I shouted, I picked them out one by one, and I tried to, maybe it's the group think that if maybe one or two of them were willing to listen because they're around stronger personalities, perhaps that's getting in the way. So I went to them individually, no luck. It says, ثُمَّ إِنِّي أَعْلَنْتُ لَهُمْ وَأَسْرَرْتُ لَهُمْ إِسْرَارًا. It's quite poetic the way it's written. That I called them aloud and I called them quietly, and they did not listen. فَقُلْتُ اسْتَغْفِرُوا رَبَّكُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ غَفَّارًا. And he shouted from the hilltops, he said, and I call you to the forgiveness of your Lord. إِنَّهُ كَانَ غَفَّارًا. He is the one that is most forgiving. He says, يُرْسِلُ السَّمَاءَ عَلَيْكُمْ مِدْرَارًا. And it continues in this way. And then eventually it says, ثُمَّ يُعِيدُكُمْ فِيهَا وَيُخْرِجُكُمْ إِخْرَاجًا وَاللَّهُ جَعَلَ لَكُمُ الْأَرْضَ بِسَاطًا لِتَسْلُكُوا مِنْهَا سُبُلًا فِجَاجًا. And then Sayyidina Nuh says, قَالَ نُوحُ الرَّبِّ إِنَّهُمْ عَصَوْنِي. Oh Allah, these people are ignoring me, they're rejecting me, they're sinning against me. In other words, they're sinning against you. وَاتَّبَعُوا مَنْ لَمْ يَزِدْهُ مَالُهُ وَوَلَدُهُ إِلَّا خَسَارًا. They follow what will not benefit them nor their children. It won't avail them, except it just increases them in their loss. وَمَكَرُوا مَكْرًا كُبَّارًا. And they just plot, and they're just becoming even more arrogant in that. وَقَالُوا لَا تَذَرُنَّ آلِهَتَكُمْ. And then they goes on to mention their idols. وَقَدْ أَضَلُّوا كَثِيرًا. And Sayyidina Nuh at this point has become despondent isn't the right word, but at this point he knew that this message was not getting to those people. They just were not going to listen. And then it's at this point, after years and years of calling people and calling them to the forgiveness of their Lord, eventually he turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he says, وَلَا تَزِدِ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا ضَلَالًا. And he said, oh Allah, do not, and this is a dua of Sayyidina, this is called the dua of Sayyidina Nuh. He says, oh Allah, do not increase the zalimin, the unjust, except in misguidance. And he said, مما خطيئاتكم آتهم أغرقوا فأدخلوا نارا فلم يجدوا لهم من دون الله أنصارا وقال نوح رب لا تذر على الأرض من الكافرين ديارا. He says, وقال نوح, and then Sayyidina Nuh says to Allah, so that he raises his hands towards God and he says, oh Allah, do not leave upon this earth a single one of these people who rejects. He says, oh Allah, do not. So, Rabbi la tazar ala al-ardi min al-kafirina dayyara. Innaka intazarhum yudillu ibadak. He says, oh Allah, at this point, they've come to such an extent now that if you let them live, they will continue on their way and they will misguide the rest of your servants. وَلَا يَلِدُوا إِلَّا فَاجِرًا كَفَارًا. And they will not give rise to give birth to except those who will continue in their path. رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيَّ. And then Sayyidina Nuh turns to God and said, oh Allah, forgive me. Yeah, meaning he almost saw it as his own failing. Oh Allah, forgive me, وَلِوَالِدَيَّ, and forgive my parents. وَلِمَنْ دَخَلَ بَيْتِيَ مُؤْمِنًا, and all those who enter in my path as believers. وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, and those who believe amongst the males and females. وَلَا تَزِدِ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا تَبَارًا. And he again repeats this, but do not increase the unrighteous, the unjust, except in destruction. That's Surah Nuh, where it goes straight to, it tells us the story of the build up to the flood. Yeah, we get the build-up of the flood. And I said Sayyidina Nuh had 5 children. We believe that one of his 5 children died before the floods came. His name was Abir. So we believe Abir. So we believe that Abir died before the floods came. One of his children died in the flood. Now, this story of the death of his son Yam, his name is Yam, yeah, Ya Alif Mim, Yam, is mentioned in another surah, in Surah Hud. So Surah Nuh gives us the build-up as to what led Sayyidina Nuh to making this dua against these people. Now people say that Sayyidina Nuh cursed these people, and that's not true. It's not true. What actually, if you read the Quran, what it actually implies is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was already going to destroy those people. Because and what Sayyidina Nuh did was he went to Allah and said, "Oh Allah, let me call them." And he persisted and persisted and persisted, and then he gave into the will of God, because he knew that wasn't going to change. So it wasn't that he wanted it, which is what does he say in the dua? He said, "Do not increase except the zalimeen." He talks about the zalimeen, and that's actually from what the Prophet ﷺ does. Whenever he would say anything about people, he would never say it by name. He would talk about a state. So people of zulm, people of kufr. Yeah. And that's why we have no authority to call somebody a kafir, or calling even somebody a zalim, because it's quite a big claim to make, to call somebody a zalim. But people of zulm, people who are zalimin, then then they are under this wrath of God, because if they die in that state, they will be treated as the zalimin and everything that encompasses. So the dua of Sayyidina Nuh was not for the people, because he said, those who believe in God, oh Allah, protect them, keep them under your protection. But he submitted to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that those who commit zulm, fasad on the earth, would be punished. So it was almost as though Sayyidina Nuh said, "Give me time so I can call them," and he did, and he persisted for years and years. Some say he did it for 50 years, if not longer. So it wasn't something that happened overnight. It was over a long period of time, and then he accepted that this is not something that will change. When we go to Surah Hud, what's interesting about Surah Hud is it gives us the specifics of that of the flood, because in this we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, he describes that moment when God orders Sayyidina Nuh to prepare this boat and to go in twos, min kullin zawjayn ithnayn, that everyone go in twos. The camera gone out of focus. So in Surah Hud we have the details where it says وَمَا آمَنَ مَعَهُ إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ. So Allah also tells us that not many people believed in Sayyidina Nuh. So a few did, إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ, a few accepted the message of Sayyidina Nuh. وَقَالَ ارْكَبُوا فِيهَا بِسْمِ اللَّهِ مَجْرَيْهَا وَمُرْسَاهَا. And then Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, when they got on the boat, he said, and in the name of Allah, majreha, will it float, and will it be anchored, meaning when it comes to a stop. Inna Rabbi laghafurur rahim, that my Lord is all forgiving and all merciful. Wa hiya tajri bihim fi mawjin kal jibali, and it was floating on this water after the floods had come. Kal jibal, as if it was a mountain. And then it says, and this is where it tells us the story of his son Yam. وَنَادَى نُوحٌ ابْنَهُ, and then Sayyidina Nuh saw in the distance his son Yam. The Quran doesn't tell us the name of his son. Yeah, so again, this is kind of extracted from other narrations. وَكَانَ فِي مَعْزِلٍ, and he happened to be between some mountains that he just noticed them perched on some rocks. Ya bunayya irkab ma'ana, he said, "Oh son, get on with us. Wala takum ma'al kafirin, don't be with those who reject God." Qala sa'awi ila jabalin ya'simuni, and his son said, no, I'm going to get to this mountain, and it will protect me from this water. Qala la asim al-yawm, and Sayyidina Nuh said to him, and Allah kind of tells us this account, he says, there will be no there are no helpers on this day. Yeah. La asim al yawm min amrillah, from the command of God. Illa man rahim, except those who God has mercy on. In other words, the people on the boat. Wahala bainahum al mawj, and a wave came between the two of them. Fakana min al mughraqin, and his son was amongst those who had who were drowned. Mughraqin. Waqila ya ardul ibla'i, and the Quran says, and then Allah addressed the earth, and He said, ibla'i ma'aki, swallow up the water. Wa ya sama'u aqli'i, and Allah said to the skies, and O clouds or sky, to cease, to desist. Waghid al-ma'u wa qudiya al-amr, and the water began to dissipate, and the command was done. Wastawat al-judi, and it stopped on al-judi. There's different opinion as to what the judi is. Waqila bu'dan lil qawm adh-dhalimin, and then it was said, meaning we don't know who said it, but it was said, and be gone the people of injustice. وَنَادَى نُوحٌ رَبَّهُ, and Sayyidina Nuh then called out to his Lord. He said, فَقَالَ رَبِّ إِنَّ ابْنِي مِنْ أَهْلِي. He said, Oh Allah, my son was from my children. وَإِنَّ وَعْدَكَ الْحَقِّ, but your promise is true. وَأَنْتَ أَحْكَمُ الْحَاكِمِينَ, and you are the one who is, and the command belongs to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says to him, قَالَ يَا نُوحْ إِنَّهُ لَيْسَ مِنْ أَهْلِكَ. Allah says, O Nuh, he is not from your children. إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ. He is rather a misdeed, and amalun ghayr, he is not a righteous deed. So this is, the Quran then tells us that your lineage, this is kind of proof for how your lineage won't help you. Yeah, your association isn't going to save you. We don't believe in kind of nepotism in the deen, because the son of Sayyidina Nuh was killed in the flood. The son of Sayyidina Adam died. These are things that are, the Quran explicitly tells us is un-Islamic. Yeah. So Allah says to him, and he even takes that away from him. It reduces that biological connection to what the connection is stronger when it's a spiritual connection. Even more so over a biological connection. So Allah says, "Innahu amalun ghayr." He is not your son, rather he is a amal ghayr salih, an action that is not pure. فَلَا تَسْأَلْنِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ. And he says, so don't ask me about things you have no knowledge about. إني أعظك أن تكون من الجاهلين قال ربي إني أعوذ بك من أن أسألك ما ليس لي به علم. He said, Oh Allah, I seek refuge from asking of you anything of which I have no knowledge. وَإِلَّا تَغْفِرْ لِي وَتَرْحَمْنِي أَكُمْ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. That if you do not forgive me, if you do not have mercy on me, then I will be of those who are lost. When we kind of fast forward into the Sira, and when the Prophet ﷺ talks about the day of resurrection, when we go for the intercession, some of you will recall that for this intercession, people will run to different prophets. Yeah. And we will go to Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, and we'd say, Oh Nuh, we'll say, intercede for us. And Sayyidina Nuh would say, I'm in no position to intercede for you, because and then he would go on to recall what he did. This is what it's in reference to. It's that Sayyidina Nuh, although this is not considered a sin at all, it's Sayyidina Nuh then felt the need to turn to God and ask for his forgiveness. And he says, if you do not have mercy on me, then I will be of those who are lost. And this is the proof for that, is that God says to him, if essentially to relax. Yeah, he said, stop, that I give you salam and barakat minni, from me, وَعَلَىٰ أُمَمٍ مِّمَّن مَّعَكَ. And this is the bit that connects us to the Sirah, where Allah says, and salam comes from me to you and to those communities that are going to come from you, and those communities that are going to come from you. And then it continues in this way. And then towards the end, and it's called Surah Hud, because later on it says, وَإِلَىٰ عَادٍ أَخَاهُمْ هُودًا, and we'll get onto that shortly. Now, what's amazing about this Surah Hud is that firstly, it completes a story that we find elsewhere. Yeah. What's interesting is, if I'm not mistaken, Surah Hud was revealed before Surah Nuh. Yeah. Surah Hud was revealed before Surah Nuh. So the order of revelation is slightly different. And we're not talking long, we're talking maybe a couple of years. Both of these are relatively early to mid Makki surahs. Yeah. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked on at least one occasion, Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh said to the Prophet ﷺ, he'd come to see him, and he noticed that the Prophet ﷺ had some white hairs, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, and he said, you have grown whiter. And the Prophet ﷺ said to him, Shayyabatni Hud wa akhawatuha. He said, Hud, meaning Surah Hud, and its sisters have made me white. Yeah, in other words, whitened, he said. There's a couple of interesting points about that. One is the fact that we know from his Shama'il, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we know from his Shama'il that he did not have more than 20 hairs, 20 white hairs when he passed away. Yeah. And there's a difference of opinion. Some say he had 17 hairs, some say 14 hairs, some say 20. I think 21 is the most that's recorded of it. That's a very small number of hairs. And yet Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, when he sees him, he notices that there's an extra white hair, which teaches us something about how closely they observed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah. And the second thing is just about the way the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was impacted by reading about the lives of the prophets that came before him. That whenever he'd read Surah Hud, it would affect him. It would physically, we know that because he tells us in various hadith. And we know from Sayyidah Aisha, for instance, whenever there'd be a strong wind, she said sometimes the Prophet he would be visibly rattled by it, because it would remind him of the stories of Thamud and the stories of Salih, because of the wind that came and destroyed the nation. So he would be visibly affected by verses of the Quran. So that shows how much he believed and was in tune with every letter, every surah of the Quran. So one of the sons of Sayyidina Nuh passed away, as I said before. Abir passed away before the flood, and one of them died during the flood. He was a disbeliever, and that leaves three sons survived him. And we said Sayyidina Nuh lived for about 350 years after the flood. One of his sons was Sam. Sam is considered to be the father of the Arabs. Yeah, Sam is considered to be one of the fathers of the Arabs. His other son, his name is Ham. Yeah, with a Ha. Ham. And his third son was called Yafith. Again, these are relatively speculative. Well, that's a bit of they're speculative in the sense that none of these are qat'i. Yeah, most of history going that far back is going to be like that. It's nothing explicit in the Quran that mentions their names. And people like Ibn Khaldun in his Tariq, and people like Imam Tabari talk about them as being fathers of the different nations. So Sam is seen as the father of the Arabs, whereas Ham is seen as the father of the Africans. And Yafith is seen as the father of the Turks, probably even the Europeans, the Chinese. And interestingly, Ibn Khaldun mentions that the Yafith is also the father of Gog and Magog, which is where you get all this stuff about Ya'juj and Ma'juj coming from China, Ya'juj and Ma'juj coming from the Turks, and so on and so forth. So there is precedent, but it's historical. Historians, just because a historian said it doesn't make it an historical fact. That's the thing to remember. Yeah, just because a historian said it doesn't make it a historical fact. We know that each of his three sons kind of ruled various parts. And kind of because they almost had to. Well, they had to restart. They had to start again. And we know that Sam was, according to the Arabs, and you could argue that this is skewed by the people that are narrating it, but they say the oldest nation that we know of was the Arabs, as in we can find somewhat of a unbroken chain back to the earliest Arabs. They ruled far and wide in that they covered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, all the way from the Indian Ocean through to the south, to the Western Gulf of of Ethiopia. They covered the Persian Gulf. That includes Yemen, Oman. There's a place called Shehr. Shehr is like the valleys between Oman and Yemen. They covered all of that. So they covered a fair amount of this kind of the whole peninsula and what's around it. Now, I want to focus just on the descendants of Sam, because that's taking us through to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. The descendants of Sam, like I said, Sam was the father of the Arabs. Ya'juj and Ma'juj is going to come from a specific place. Anyone who tells you they know is a liar. Put it that way. I'm gonna regret saying this, but because everyone likes it. I mean, I can probably come up with 5 different sources of and different narrations from different people in different points in history who have said 5 different things. It's easy to show off and produce one of them and say, well, here's proof, but it's not proof. None of this is proof. It's all speculative. We don't know. We simply don't know. We don't even know what the Ya'juj and Ma'juj are made up of, who they are, what we don't know any of these things, whether they're a tribe or specific people. Was it, we don't know any of that stuff. A lot of this is all speculative, and people have made a lot of people. You can build a nice reputation talking about this sort of stuff, but the truth is we don't know. It's interesting. I'm not saying people shouldn't talk about speculative stuff like this, but I think we have to be honest to say we don't know, because we genuinely don't. And anyone who claims they do, as I said, they're lying. If they say this is possibly the truth, then fair enough. But if anyone says categorically they know, they just don't. There were 3 types of Arabs. The first type of Arab are what called the Ba'ida, also known as the Ariba. Yeah, the Ba'ida. It literally means the extinct Arabs. Why are they important? They're important because all of the early prophets, basically the stories of Hud, the surah that we've just touched on, the people of Ad, the people of Thamud, they were all from the Ba'ida. Yeah, they were all from the extinct Arabs. So a lot of those early prophets, the Sayyidina Shu'aib, Sayyidina Hud, Sayyidina Salih, they were sent to communities of Arabs that are no longer exist. Yeah, but the prophets were nonetheless sent to them. That's the first level, and I'll talk about some of those. I'll just touch on some of those, inshallah. Well, time's just flown on us, and I've not got very far. The second group are known as the Muta'arriba. Yeah, Muta'arriba. They are also known as the Qahtani Arabs. Yeah, and the reason why they call that is because they mixed with the original Arabs. They lived and they traded and worked with the earliest Arabs, the extinct Arabs, but they survived. So although they didn't originate from the same, they were not from that original tribe, they did kind of intersect with them and marry within them, and therefore they are what we call the pure Arabs, but they're not the original Arabs of Ad and Thamud. They stem from somebody called Qahtan. Yeah, and there's a tribe called the Jurhum that also come from this group, this second group known as the Qahtani or Muta'arriba. Why is that second group important? The second group is important because it's Sayyidina Ismail marrying into this second group of Arabs, which leads to what is the third group of Arabs. Yeah. So the second group, which is the Jurhumi Arabs or the what I call the Qahtani Arabs, they met Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam in Mecca, yeah, and Sayyidina Ismail married into them, into the Jurhamites. And when he married into them, their children, his children were, one of his descendants was called Adnan, and it was through Adnan that we have Ma'ad and so on, all the way to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's, and that third group then, that from the bloodline of Sayyidina Ismail, are known as the Adnani Arabs. Okay, they're called the Adnani Arabs. So we have the extinct Arabs, we have what are called the pure Arabs, and then we have what are called the Adnani Arabs, which have a mixture of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, and of course the pure Arabs. So just I want to quickly touch on a couple of the tribes of that first group of Arabs, which are known as the extinct Arabs. The first of those is the people of Ad, and we have mentioned that in the Quran. For instance, in various places, in fact, there's a number of places where this is mentioned, but we in fact have a lot of the stories mentioned, in a fair amount of detail. But the kind of a small mention of that is in Surah Al-Fajr, where Allah says, "Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi'ad, irama dhatil imad." Yeah, Allah says, have you not heard of the people of Ad? Irama dhatil imad, the Iram dhatil imad, the thing, the place, the essence that has these great pillars. التي لم يخلق مثلها بلاد, which the like of which no other city has ever seen. Yeah, so many of the commentators say the people of Ad. So firstly, the people of Ad were descendants of who? Sayyidina Sam, who was the son of Sayyidina Nuh. These are the earliest Arabs that are extinct now. They themselves were pious. They were in the early period. They were pious people that followed the footsteps of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam. But as time went on, they lost their way and they started idol worshipping. And when that happened, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then sent them Prophet Hud. Yeah, he sent them Sayyidina Hud alayhi salam. And we know that, well, again, I say we know, we don't actually know. This is again speculative, but Ad had a number of sons. One of them was Shadid, other one was called Shaddad, the other one was called Iram. This is biblical, actually. Yeah, this is biblical. So we have three names, Shadid, Shaddad, and Iram. And Allah mentions Iram. So some commentators say when God talks about Iram, he's talking about his son, one of the sons of Ad, who took over the kingdom after his brothers died. So it's kind of one after Ad, it was his son Shadid, then Shaddad, then Iram took over. What were they known for? The people of Ad were known for their beautiful buildings. They were ahead of their time technologically. Yeah, technologically, they were ahead of their time. And they put a lot of effort and invested a lot of time and money into creating these beautiful pillared cities. And they say they had, some of them were made of gold and marble and goodness knows what else. And they lost their way in that they were so far gone in the dunya that they'd forgotten that all of this came from God. So actually, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the people of Ad, it's a reminder that none of this was from you, this came from God, and they kept rejecting. There's an exchange in the Quran between the people of Ad and Sayyidina Hud alayhi salam. But in Surah Al-Fajr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about them, and he tells us that they were people of Dhat al-Imad. Some of the commentators say that Iram was actually a city that was made of gold and had these huge pillars and had all these amazing streams that ran through it and so on and so forth. It's described as, they say, again, people speculatively, they say that Iram was created as to challenge paradise. Yeah, it was to say that we can create a paradise far, far greater than God can. So they created this place, which is now lost. Ibn Khaldun, however, rejects that. Ibn Khaldun says that, and people like Imam Tabari, Imam Bayhaqi, and all these great scholars say that it was actually a city. Imam Ibn Khaldun rejects it. He says it wasn't a city. Iram was actually the name of a tribe. No such city like that existed. It was the name of a tribe. So that gives you an idea of how how you can have something that seems so obvious when you read the Quran. It says Iram Zat al-Imad, Iram, the city that has these great pillars, and then no city was built like it, and you'd assume that it's talking about a city, whereas you can have an opinion like that of Ibn Khaldun, which suggests it's not a city, it just appears to be that way, but actually with a bit more historical information and knowledge, it turns out it's a tribe. We don't know. We don't know. I'm just mentioning it, inshallah, so that you're aware of that. The story of Sayyidina Hud alayhi salam, the detail of this is mentioned in Surah Shu'ara. Yeah, in Shu'ara. But Allah, in fact, there's a number of prophets that mention this. So really, if you want a good starting point, if you want to get familiar with the stories of the prophets of past, is to go to Surah Shu'ara, because Allah gives us that one by one. So here it's كذبت عاد المرسلين, that the people of Ad rejected the message of their prophets. إذ قال لهم أخوهم هود لا تتقون, when their brother Hud came and said to them, why do you not fear God? إني لكم رسول أمين, that I've come to you as a honest messenger. فاتقوا الله وأطيعون, so just be aware of God and worship him. وما أسألكم عليه من أجر إن أجري إلا على رب العالمين. And it continues in this way. So it goes through is Sayyidina Hud alayhi salam calling them to the message. And what's interesting is kind of as you go through the surah, and about in when we get to verse 138, they say in hadha illa khuluqul awwalin. They say to Sayyidina Hud, what you're telling us is what used to be said to the people of the past. In other words, they believed that God had, his wrath was just for the people of the past. This would no longer happen to them. وَمَا نَحْنُ بِمُعَذَّبِينَ. They said, look, we will never be punished by God. فَكَذَّبُوهُ فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُم. So Allah says, they accused him of being a liar, so we destroyed them. Yeah. Inna fi dhalika la'aya. Allah says, and this is addressed to us. It says, Inna fi dhalika la'aya, that within this is a great sign. وَمَا كَانَ أَكْثَرُهُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Many of them rejected. And this is talking about the people of Ad. And it continues and tells us the story of Sayyidina, the people of Thamud, to whom Salih was sent, and so on. That was one of the early extinct Arabs. Another group was called the Abil. They lived between Mecca and Medina, and they said that they died with the flood. Yeah, so when the floods came, they died with them. We have the story, of course, of Sayyidina of the people of Thamud and Sayyidina Salih. They lived in a place called Hijr. We have an entire surah named after this too. So if you want to know this story, it doesn't tell us the whole story. Again, you have to kind of work your way through the Quran, but it's a good place to start. Surah Al-Hijr is an entire surah dedicated. Al-Hijr is a place. It's about a few hundred kilometers away, about 100 miles or so away from Medina to Munawwara. It's kind of in the northwest. It's a place called Hijr. It's a very mountainous area, and we know one of the things that we know about the Thamud is, and this comes from the Quran, is وَثَمُودَ الَّذِينَ جَابُوا الصَّخْرَ بِالْوَادِ, again in Surah Al-Fajr, where Allah says, and there were people who would engrave into stones, and Ibn Khaldun says that they were some of the first to leave markings, etch engravings into stone. So that's one of the things that they used to do. Some of the historians say that they were very large. They were big, many meters tall. Again, there's no actual evidence that supports that, other than the fact that people have said this. We simply don't know. The fact that they live in mountains, for some reason, that's been perhaps maybe the link has been made that they were therefore very tall. You can probably find, if you're looking for either opinion, I'm sure you can find it in the internet. So the simple answer is we don't know how tall they were. What we do know about them is from hadith, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on the way to the Battle of Tabuk, he passed by the valleys of Al-Hijr, and he told the Sahaba not to drink water from there. Yeah, he told the Sahaba not to drink. Marra fi ghazwati Tabuk, bi Qura Thamud, that he passed by the city of the people of Thamud. فَنَهَا عَنْ إِسْتِعْمَالِ مِيَاهِهِمْ, and he prohibited the Muslims, the people, from drinking the water. And he said, لَا تَدْخُلُوا مَسَاكِنَ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُم. He said, do not, and this becomes almost like a principle for us. He said, don't enter the lands, the houses of those people who, it was interesting, who wrong themselves. Yeah, لا تدخلوا مساكن الذين ظلموا أنفسهم. And he says, إلا وأنتم باكون أن يصيبكم ما أصابهم. He said, for fear that perhaps you may cry for yourself that what befell them may befall you. Yeah. So that's we don't necessarily take these words literally. The point is that you avoid places of azab. Yeah, especially if the Prophet explicitly told us. And the people of Thamud, we know, were destroyed by a wind. Sayyidina Salih was sent, and they were challenged with this, a she camel, and they were to not harm it. And they mocked Sayyidina Salih, and eventually they killed this she camel. I won't go into the story now because it's quite late, but they were all destroyed. And there is a narration from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahu alam how strong this is, but some of the Sahaba asked him about the people of Thamud. He said, did anyone survive that wind? And the Prophet said, one person. According to this narration, one person. He said, Abu Righal. A man named Abu Righal survived it. And they said, how? And he said he was in the haram at the time. Yeah, he was in the haram at the time, and he survived the floods. Allahu a'lam. And then we have others like the Tasm, the Judais, the Amalika, and so on. There's lots of these are the first kind of extinct Arabs. So from Sam, as I said, these early Arabs descended, and then we had the Arabs that came after that second group, the Muta'ariba. Now we also have from Ham, which is one of the other brothers of sons of Sayyidina Nuh. From them descended a man called Canaan. His name was Canaan. You may be familiar with the term Canaan, right? Canaan from the biblical literature. Canaan was he ruled for a number of years. They say probably over 100 years. He ruled all the way from Sham, which is the historical Levant, all the way through to Babylon, so Mesopotamia. So he had a large chunk of, so that's Iraq, that's Syria, that's Palestine. All of these regions were under his kind of within his domain. And it's said that he built Babylon. Allahu Alam, because I don't know, but it's claimed that he also was one of the builders of Babylon. So he came from the children of Ham. By the time they got to Canaan, they had lost their way, right? So again, from Ham, the people had lost their way, and from within them, they rose up another group called the Kaldaniyun, or the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans actually lived in that time, but they descended from Sam. They descended from the son Sam, who was from where the Arabs came from. So the Chaldeans descended from them. And they battled with the people of Canaan, and eventually they took control, but for a brief few years. And that's all very controversial in the sense that a lot of what the Muslim historians describe about it is probably not what you're going to find in mainstream literature. Again, this is all speculative. It's different places, you'll find different things. The bit that I'm interested in here is that Canaan, his son, was a man, and some say it wasn't his son, it was his great-grandson, but I'm just going to assume it was his son. Canaan's son was Nimrod. Nimrud was his son. And from the Chaldeans you have Azar, and from him Ibrahim alayhi salam. So what we have is through Sam we do have Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and through Ham we have Nimrod. So this is where the kind of the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam starts, and this is where it connects to Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam. So when Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was born, what happened? We know that at this point, according to the Torah, according to the Bible, that his father, Ibrahim's father, had 3 sons. Yeah, Ibrahim, Nahur, and Haran. Yeah, 3 sons. Ibrahim, Nahur, and Haran. This is according to the Muslim account of what the Bible contains or contained within it. And they say Haran passed away. Haran, so one of his brothers died. So and then what that was yeah, so so Ibrahim had 3 brothers, Ibrahim, Nahur, and Haran died. It was Lut alayhi salam, the prophet Lut was Haran's son. So the prophet Lut was actually the nephew of, he was the, sorry, was he the nephew? He was the cousin of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He was the cousin of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was born in, there's different opinion on this. Some say he was born in Ur, so this is called the Ur of Chaldea. Yeah, so this is in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. Others said that he was born in Hebron, and others said that he was born in Babylon. It doesn't really matter so much. What matters is that, again, from the historians, we hear that some of the soothsayers said to Nimrod, that a child will be born who will yukhalifuddin, that he will go against the religion, your religion, wa yuksirul asnam, wa yukassirul asnam, and he will destroy your idols, wal awthan. And he said, he will destroy your idols. So what did Nimrod do? Nimrod had all the babies killed in that time. So babies born that year, he had them all killed. Again, this is not you don't find this in the Muslim, you don't find this in the Quran. This is not in there. So I just want to make it clear that this is all found in various traditions, and all of these are speculative. He had all of them killed. But Sayyidina Ibrahim's mother, knowing this is happening, took her son, left him in a cave, in a valley, in somewhere where people can look after him, where he'd be protected. And she left him there until he was old enough, so that if someone saw him, they wouldn't know which year he was born. He could have been born a year after or a year before the alleged year that Nimrod had killed all these children. So he was there for a few years. Yeah. And it was at that time. Now, this connects to where we were last week. It was at that time, we believe, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him, and he asked those questions like, who is my, not who is my Lord, but kind of like rhetorically saying, my Lord can't be the sun, it can't be the moon, it can't be the stars. And then when Sayyidina Ibrahim is returned back to, his mother picks him up and takes him back home to Ur of Chaldea, which is where they live. And then the story unfolds, and I covered this last week, so I won't go into the particulars of this. Is the Abil another group of extinct Arabs? Yes. Yeah, they are. The people of Thamud and Ad are often talked about together. How are they related? Because they were, so both of them were tribes that descended from the same line. Yeah, so both of them met through the bloodline, both to Sam, which is the son of Nuh. Yeah, so from Sayyidina Nuh to Sam, the tribes split, and from those tribes, from kind of the great grandsons, they came the Thamud, and they came the Ad. Yeah, and that's why they referred to as kind of brothers, because they both came from like tribes that were like next to each other. That's the link between the two of them. Yeah, exactly. So I won't go through what I covered last week, as I said, because that's already been I've already covered it last week. The bit, I suppose, of that I want to make sure I capture here is, and the bit I didn't touch on last week is eventually the king after the incident in the fire, Nimrod called Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he said to him, look, what is it that your Lord can do that I can't do? This is in Surah Baqarah now. Alam tara ila alladhi hajja Ibrahim fi rabbih أن أتاه الله الملك إذ قال إبراهيم ربي الذي يحيي ويميت. He says, Nimrod says to him, what is that your Lord can do that I can't do? Sayyidina Ibrahim said, Yuhyi wa yumit, he gives life and he gives death. Qala ana uhyi wa umit, and then Nimrod says, I give life, I give death. What's interesting here is Nimrod, the name is not mentioned. There is no mention of Nimrod in the Quran. Okay, so again, this is a lot of this is passed through traditions of narrators and historians, and we assume it, but there is ikhtilaf on this, even as to who Nimrod is in the so there is, these are points of difference. So the Quran doesn't mention the name. قال إبراهيم فإن الله يأتي بالشمس من المشرق فأتي بها من المغرب. He says, my Lord brings the sun up from the east, why don't you make it rise from the west? فبهت الذي كفر. And the Quran says, and the one who rejects, he was left dumbfounded. Wallahu la yahdi al-qawm al-zalimin. Allah does not guide the nation that is oppressive. Yeah. So that's, now when that happened, the scholars say that at that point Sayyidina Ibrahim had to leave. Yeah, Sayyidina Ibrahim had to leave Ur, and from there, when he left from there, they say that yes, from there he left for Hebron. And it was at that point, again, we have different accounts on this, so the Muslims don't really have much information on this now. But according to Imam Suhaili, it was in Hebron that Sayyidina Ibrahim's father passed away. Yeah, so Imam Suhaili says this, but it's not. Imam Suhaili is one of our great. He wrote a commentary on the Sira of Ibn Hisham, which is probably a condensed version of Ibn Ishaq, which is a voluminous work, with much of which is lost. It's one of the earliest Siras that we have of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Imam Suhaili says that his father died in Hebron. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to leave from Chaldea. Chaldea is modern day southern Iraq, and to head towards Hebron. He had to leave. Hebron is where? In Palestine. And as I said, Imam Suhaili says that's where his father passed away. The Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam from there was then commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to leave and go to a place called Canaan or Canaan, right? And he was to go there, and he also had with him who? He had his wife Sara with him, and he had his cousin Sayyidina Lut with him. Yeah. Now the biblical account mentions other people. It says that he had his brother with him and his brother's wife with him and a few other people that were with him. Allahu alam, we have no real mention of this. The Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam with Sayyidina Lut, then on the way to Canaan, we know that he went to Jerusalem, because from just the direction to Canaan is that you're going through Egypt, right? Eventually you got to Jerusalem, and then it's Jericho, and then you're going straight up and you're in Canaan. Yeah. So we know on the way they'd heard at this point, by the way, I'm describing it like it happened over a couple of years. We know that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam at this stage was about 75 years old. So we've missed a massive chunk. And I missed that because there's not much that's known about the what happened in those years. Yeah, we don't know. But just like with the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, the Quran mentions that he called people, but it doesn't say how long. So it's not something that the prophets did over 6 months, a year, 2 years. Sometimes the prophets did it for many, many, many years. And some of the prophets lived for hundreds of years, as far as we hear. So when the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam got to Baytul Maqdis, yeah, when he got to Baytul Maqdis, which is also called Baytul Muqaddas, by the way. So you might hear Muqaddas, you might have Maqdis. Both of these are valid readings of the name of Baytul Maqdis in Jerusalem. When he got there, he was about 75 years old. And at that point, they had heard that the people of Canaan were going through a severe drought. There was a food shortage. So what he then did was that him and his wife Sarah and Lut, they decided to go to Egypt, and to ask for some assistance. And this is where, again, last week I touched on this, the events that unfolded with Sayyidah Sarah, in that the prince there attacked her and each time she made dua and he froze. And again, there's differences in those accounts, but eventually some scholars say that it was that prince that gave Sarah the gift of Hajra. Hajra was to become the mother of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. Other scholars say that actually it was the prince of Jordan, the king of Jordan, that gave it. There's difference of opinion on this. Yeah. But the point is, at this point now, when they leave, let's assume that it was that king. When they leave from Egypt, they're heading towards Canaan. Now they have Hajra with them. Okay. Now, on the way to Palestine, so on the way to Canaan, this is where Sayyidina Lut parts ways, because Sayyidina Lut alayhi salam, his calling was, Allah called him to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, so he headed towards the part of Palestine where he was to meet the 5 tribes of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then that would unfold. And again, the Quran talks about this, but again, for shortage of time, I'm not going to go into that. And Sayyidina Ibrahim, Sayyidina Hajra, Sayyidina Sarah continue on the journey to Canaan. So when they get to Canaan, then from there, this, as we inshallah next week, it's 11 o'clock now, so I apologize for continuing for as long as I have. From there, we'll talk about how what happened to Sayyidina Sarah, what happened to Sayyidina Hajra, how is it that eventually Sayyidina Hajra ended up in Mecca and Sayyidina Ismail ended there, where does Sayyidina Ibrahim go, and then we'll start hopefully building up the story as we get to closer to the Sira of the Prophet, the specific birth of the Prophet. So hopefully it's been beneficial. I've tried to cram in quite a lot into a very small space of time. I'm always, I think I'm guilty of this a lot, where I've got a lot going on in there, but I have a lot of faith in you guys, and I know that you're all very capable people, and I think you can, where there's gaps, you can probably fill them. And inshallah, I hope you find it beneficial and you stay with me, because it will be an interesting journey, and it'll be one of learning for all of us. Let me see if there's any questions I can attempt to answer. That's a good question. It's probably going to require a bit of an answer. Why are so many prophets reported to have been sent to the Arabs? The simple reason for that, well, one reason for that is because the Arabs were, as I said, if we say that the Arabs have the longest lineage, and a lot of they descend from 3 brothers, then it makes sense, because firstly, a lot of the history that we know of comes through that chain. We're not saying that prophets weren't sent to the people of Ham. We're not saying the prophets because they were sent through the Israelites. Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam, and there's we've got plenty of prophets that went through those chains, and equally there's many prophets that we have no knowledge of, and the reason why we don't have any knowledge of them is because it's not relevant to us. Yeah, so it's not to say that God didn't send prophets. He did. We don't necessarily have to have knowledge of every single prophet that was sent. In fact, we know we haven't. But the lineage, the line that we would we trace back is the line through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where there is, and where it intersects with the Banu Israel, then we have knowledge of those prophets too. But Allahu Alam. Was Quran a place in Egypt and also? No, Canaan isn't in Egypt. Canaan is in Palestine, Israel now. Yeah, it's in the northern part. And also the person being the Bible. Yeah, so there's these sorts of things is where it gets really messy, because you have multiple people with the same name, multiple countries and cities with the same name. So that happens quite a lot. So there are cities that are named that have a name in the same city in Egypt, in Palestine, and also in Iraq. Yeah, so it can get messy like that. So But the answer to that question is Canaan came from the name of a person, Canaan. Yeah. And yes, he was from the forefathers of, and some say the father of Nimrod. And the city, I mean, the place was named after him. We will have 2 plus in the evening. Oh, that's stable. Was Lady Hajra given to the Prophet Ibrahim in Egypt? Yes, was it? So Hajra was not given to Sayyidina Ibrahim; she was given to Sarah. So we believe she was given in Egypt, but some scholars say she was given in Jordan. Yeah, and there's about at least 4 opinions that I'm aware of from people like Tabari, from Ibn Khaldun. So there are differences of opinion on this. When was she given to Sayyidina Ibrahim? It was actually Sayyidina Sarah gave the Prophet Ibrahim Sayyidina Hajra 10 years later. Yeah, 10 years later, because we know the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is around 85, 86. When Sayyidina Sarah gave Ibrahim alayhi salam Hajra, because she said that she herself could not have children. So she said, God has promised you children. So she gifted Sayyidina Hajra to him and he married her. So, but we'll talk about that inshallah next week. Ibrahim's father had 3 sons, Ibrahim, Haran, and Nahur. And Sayyidina Lut, so therefore, yeah, Sayyidina Lut would be the he would be the nephew, not the cousin. Yeah, he would be the nephew. That's correct. Okay. Thank you for that clarification, Afsa. Perfect. Okay, inshallah, we'll sign out. Jazakumullah khair, and we'll continue this journey from Canaan, where we'll talk more about Sayyidah Hajara, and from there, inshallah, we'll go to we'll hopefully work our way through to Arabia.